I want you, our learner, to try a little thought experiment with us just to, start things off today.
Yeah.
Picture an ideology,
Ah.
like a highly specific, codified way of seeing the world and organizing human behavior.
Right.
And imagine that this ideology has remained completely unbroken and entirely focused on a single overarching goal for roughly 1,400 years.
That's a massive span of time.
It really is. I mean, it doesn't waver. It doesn't fundamentally change its core objective, even as these, massive empires rise and fall around it.
Yeah.
Even as technology shifts from, the sword all the way to the smartphone.
Yeah.
Now, I want you to imagine what happens when that deeply confident ancient ideology suddenly intersects with a modern society, a society that has, for all intents and purposes, essentially forgotten its own history, one that actively questions its own foundational values and that is at a structural level fundamentally demoralized. What happens in that specific collision?
Well, it creates a highly volatile asymmetry. I mean, you're basically describing the ultimate irresistible force meeting a highly permeable, almost completely undefended object.
Exactly.
And understanding the mechanics of that specific collision is, well, it's arguably the key to decoding so much of the geopolitical tension we're witnessing across the globe right now.
And that collision, that's the architecture of today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We are tackling a massive, incredibly complex, and heavily layered topic today.
We definitely are.
Our primary source is a really detailed transcript of an interview. It features the author, historian, and geopolitical analyst Raymond Ibrahim, and this is from his appearance on the Tom Bilyeu Show.
Right, and Ibrahim approaches this with a really unique lens,
He does, because he was born in the United States, but to Egyptian immigrant parents who are Coptic Christians.
Which is an important distinction.
Right. Meaning they belong to a group that's been indigenous to Egypt since long before the 7th century. He reads the primary Arabic texts in their original language. And, he presents this highly provocative core thesis.
Yeah.
He argues that Islam should not be viewed merely as a religion, at least not in the way the modern West understands that word, but rather as a coherent, comprehensive, and ultimately expansionist political system, one that he claims is fundamentally incompatible with the modern West.
Okay, so before we take a single step further into this material, we really must pause and establish very clear parameters for this specific deep dive.
Absolutely.
The source material we are unpacking today contains highly politically charged content. I mean, it intersects with extremely sensitive issues regarding religion, historical memory, mass immigration, and civilizational conflict.
It hits all the third rails.
It really does. So we must make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are acting strictly as neutral analysts today.
Completely neutral. We are not taking sides here. We're not approaching this from some left-wing perspective or a right-wing perspective. And we are emphatically not endorsing the viewpoints, the claims, or, the historical interpretations made by Raymond Ibrahim in the source text.
Right. Our mission today is purely analytical and educational. We are just taking the arguments exactly as Ibrahim presented them and breaking down the underlying logic.
We want to explore the historical claims he's making.
Exactly, and try to help you fully understand the specific worldview he is constructing. We want to understand what he is arguing and the mechanisms of why he believes it without taking a position on whether he's right or wrong.
We're just here to examine the blueprint of his argument.
Precisely. Just looking at the blueprint.
So let's step directly into that blueprint. To understand Ibrahim's modern warning to the West, we have to begin by looking at how he completely redefines the subject matter right out of the gate.
He does. He actively pulls Islam out of the realm of pure theology, right?
Yeah.
And he places it squarely in the realm of political science, jurisprudence, and honestly, military history.
He makes this really sharp distinction between the word Islam and the word Sharia.
And he frames that distinction by pointing out a massive cultural blind spot we have. In the post-Enlightenment West, we've constructed this very specific, neat little personal box for the concept of religion.
It's a private affair.
Exactly. It's what you do in a church or a synagogue or a mosque on the weekend. It's your personal internal relationship with the divine, completely separate from the state.
Right. Separation of church and state is just baked into our DNA now.
But Ibrahim argues that projecting this Western secularized framework onto Islam is a catastrophic analytical error. He asserts that Islam is really merely the descriptive name of the faith, but Sharia, which we, often loosely translate as Islamic law, is the prescriptive real-world political application of it.
It's the action.
Right, and his critical point is that they are inherently the very same entity. You simply cannot sever the theology from the jurisprudence.
I like to think of it with a technological analogy. Like the West looks at religion as just one app running on the smartphone of society.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. You can open the app on Sunday, and you close it on Monday when you go to work. But Ibrahim is saying that Sharia isn't an app. It's the underlying operating system.
It's the iOS.
Yeah. It dictates the hardware, the software, the network connections, everything. So when a Western politician says something like, we welcome Islam, but we absolutely reject Sharia, Ibrahim's framework suggests that this politician is basically speaking utter nonsense.
Because they're asking for a computer to run without an operating system.
Exactly.
And that is the exact friction point he highlights. He argues that Sharia isn't some radical accretion that got tacked onto the side of a peaceful faith by modern extremists. He claims it is the original, unadulterated operating system.
And to prove this, he takes the listener all the way back to the very beginning.
Right, immediately following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD.
Because, according to Ibrahim, once the Arabian Peninsula was consolidated under the banner of Islam, the early Muslims didn't just, settle down and build a localized, peaceful theocracy.
No, they didn't. He says they immediately initiated what he categorizes as a long, constant war of ideological conquest.
And the sheer velocity of the numbers he throws out here is staggering. I mean, he maps out a timeline showing that within just one single century of Muhammad's death,
just 100 years?
Yes, spanning from 632 AD to 732 AD, which culminated at the Battle of Tours, where Islamic expansion was finally halted deep in the center of France.
Right.
Within that one century, Islamic forces conquered 3/4 of the existing Christian world.
It's almost hard to fathom. 100 years to swallow up 75% of a major global religion's territory?
To really grasp the magnitude of that, you have to mentally erase the modern map of the Middle East and look at the geopolitical reality of late antiquity.
Right, because today, if you ask an average Westerner to picture the Muslim world, they reflexively picture Egypt, Syria, Turkey, North Africa.
That's just the default.
But Ibrahim points out that in the 7th century, those specific geographies were not only Christian, they were the absolute beating heartlands of global Christianity.
They were vastly more central to the faith, structurally and theologically, than Northern Europe was at the time.
Yeah, he brings up St. Augustine to really hammer this home. St. Augustine is arguably the foundational architect of Western Christian theology.
Yeah.
Yet, Ibrahim reminds us, Augustine was a Berber from modern-day Tunisia.
He was North African.
Exactly. The most influential early church fathers were Egyptians and Syrians. I mean, if you look at the 5 major administrative centers of early Christianity, Rome, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, Jerusalem, and Constantinople.
4 of those 5 massive pillars fell to this rapid Islamic expansion.
Yeah. Only Rome survived that initial century of kinetic warfare.
Which raises a really fascinating historiographical question, right?
Yeah.
Why does the modern average Westerner possess almost zero awareness of this massive civilizational shift?
It's a huge blind spot.
Why do we look at Egypt or Syria today and just assume this inherent eternal Eastern or Islamic identity?
Well, Ibrahim places the blame for that heavily on the taxonomic choices made by modern Western academics when they teach history.
The naming conventions. He argues the way we label these conflicts entirely masks the ideological engine driving them.
Exactly. Historians, when detailing these conquests, have a really strong tendency to use localized ethnic or national identifiers.
Right.
They teach university students about the Arab conquests or the Moors invading Spain or the Seljuk Turks, the Tatars, the Saracens.
Right. And when a student hears those terms, their brain just processes it as standard secular historical background noise.
Yeah, like the Moors fought the Spanish, just like the French fought the English, or the Romans fought the Gauls.
It's just tribes fighting tribes over land.
Exactly. And by reducing the conquerors to ethnic labels, modern academia strips away the unifying transnational ideological component.
But Ibrahim points out that if you actually read the primary sources, specifically the Muslim primary texts and chronicles from those eras, they did not primarily view themselves as Arabs, Turks, or Moors.
No, their self-identified primary allegiance was as Muslims.
Their stated, documented rationale for waging war against the Christians in the Levant, or the Zoroastrians in Persia, or the Hindus in the Indian subcontinent, It wasn't a secular declaration of, hey, we want your agricultural output and your gold mines.
Even though resource extraction obviously occurred.
Right, of course it did.
Yeah.
But the legally documented theological rationale was, you are the infidel, and the divine mandate of Islam requires that we subjugate you.
And they presented the conquered populations with 3 strict choices, right? Convert to Islam, die by the sword, or pay a punitive tribute and live as subjugated second-class citizens.
Okay, let me push back on this on behalf of our listener, because a critical historian would immediately raise a red flag here.
Oh, absolutely.
Isn't the entire history of the human race just an endless chronicle of empires conquering each other for resources? I mean, the Roman Empire violently subjugated the known world. The Persian Empire did the exact same thing. The British colonized half the globe. Yeah. So is this 7th century Islamic expansion truly a uniquely ideological war? Or is Ibrahim simply taking the standard, brutal, territorial physics of medieval empire building and just slapping a religious label on it to make it sound uniquely nefarious?
And that is the precise counter-argument leveled by many secular historians and geopolitical analysts. They operate on the premise that empire building is a universal human constant, driven strictly by geography, caloric resources, and power vacuums.
Right, it's just human nature at scale.
But Ibrahim's specific counter to that materialist view is that standard historical empires, like the Romans or the Mongols, primarily sought land, taxation, and political submission. The Romans, for example, were famously syncretic. They generally did not care which specific deity you prayed to, provided you paid your imperial taxes and, occasionally burned incense to the emperor to show political loyalty.
The Roman model was basically just an acquisition strategy. Like, oh, you have a local god of the harvest. Great, we'll just put his statue over here next to Ceres, keep farming, pay your tribute, and we won't crucify you.
Yeah, it was highly pragmatic.
Pragmatic, not theological.
Precisely. But Ibrahim argues that the Islamic expansion was structurally different because it was propelled by specific, codified religious doctrines that mandated theological supremacy, not just political administration.
The conquest wasn't merely a byproduct of a growing empire.
No, the physical conquest was the theological mandate fulfilling itself, and crucial to his overarching thesis. He argues that those exact codified doctrines are not dead, archaic history.
Right.
They are active, functioning software running in the background of the Islamic world today.
Well, if Ibrahim is claiming this wasn't just standard resource-driven empire building, we really need to pop the hood and examine the specific ideological software that he says runs this system.
We do.
And he breaks this architecture down into 3 core doctrines that he believes make Islam uniquely challenging, if not entirely incompatible, with the modern West. Let's delve into the first one, which hinges on a really specific Arabic concept.
Yeah, the foundational doctrine he points to is called al-wala wal-bara. In English, it translates roughly to loyalty and enmity.
Loyalty and enmity.
Right. Sometimes you'll see it simplified in Western texts as love and hate, but the translation of loyalty and enmity captures the deep political and communal dimension much more accurately.
So what are the actual mechanics of this doctrine? Like, how does it instruct a believer to operate in their daily life?
Well, according to Ibrahim's reading of the Arabic jurisprudence, this doctrine mandates that a Muslim's ultimate loyalty, alliance, and love must be given exclusively to other Muslims.
Ummah.
Exactly, to the Ummah. The Ummah is the supranational global Islamic community that is designed to completely transcend and override race, language, nationality, or geography.
Okay.
Conversely, the Bara portion of the doctrine mandates active disavowal, renunciation, and literal enmity or hatred toward the non-Muslim, categorized broadly as the infidel.
The historical context of how this doctrine was forged is fascinating, too. He explains how Muhammad essentially hot-wired the existing sociological realities of his era to make this function.
He really did.
Because if you look at 7th century Arabia, you are looking at an environment defined by intense hyper-tribalism. In the harsh reality of the desert, it was your blood family and your immediate tribe against everyone else. A blood feud was a matter of basic survival.
Yeah, it was zero-sum.
Right. And Muhammad took that deeply ingrained tribal mechanism and overlaid a sweeping theological paradigm onto it. He transformed the survival mechanism of my blood family versus your blood family into the global theological community of believers versus the rest of the entire world.
It represents a highly effective, if deeply exclusionary, sociopolitical innovation. I mean, in the pre-Islamic Bedouin tribal system, the individual not belonging to your bloodline possessed absolutely no inherent rights.
Not at all.
You could raid their caravans, kill their men, and enslave their women without incurring any moral penalty or stigma within your own group.
Because they weren't your tribe.
Right. By shifting the boundaries of the tribe away from genetic bloodlines and toward theological submission, Muhammad created a community that was infinitely expandable. Anyone could join. But crucially, it retained that harsh, unforgiving tribal boundary against the outsider.
Ibrahim cites a very specific textual example to ground this concept. He points to chapter 60, verse 4 of the Quran. And this verse utilizes the figure of Abraham to demonstrate the doctrine in action.
Right, and it's really important to note how Islam incorporates many biblical figures but assigns them slightly different roles or emphasizes different actions.
Yeah, they aren't always one-to-one matches with the Judeo-Christian versions.
Exactly. In the Islamic textual rendering, Abraham is held up as the supreme archetype for believers, specifically because he turns to his non-believing kinsmen and explicitly declares that eternal enmity and hatred will exist between them until they submit to believing in Allah alone.
And Ibrahim notes that the text directly instructs Muslims, saying he is a good example for you. It's an explicit template for how a believer is supposed to orient their emotional and social posture towards non-Muslims, even if those non-Muslims are blood relatives.
Yeah.
And to show how this ancient text operates in the modern world, Ibrahim translated a video of a contemporary Egyptian cleric discussing this exact doctrine of al-wala wal-bara.
This is a really striking example.
It really is. The cleric was answering a legal question about whether a Muslim man is permitted to marry a Christian or Jewish woman, a woman of the book.
And the cleric's legal ruling perfectly illustrates the clinical application of the doctrine.
The cleric stated that yes, legally under Sharia, a Muslim man can marry her, he can have relations with her, he can enjoy her companionship, but this is the massive ped, but he is commanded to maintain a baseline of hatred for her in his heart because she remains an infidel.
And he must let her know that he actively hates her religious beliefs.
Right. From a modern Western post-Enlightenment perspective, where love and marriage are deeply intertwined with mutual respect and shared values, separating your legal and physical obligations from your emotional hostility, it feels like an impossible cognitive dissonance.
It's a massive psychological contortion.
It creates a profound friction with the Western understanding of human relationships.
It really does.
But I have to interject here, though. Are we seriously supposed to judge an entire modern population of nearly 2 billion people by a literal, hardcore reading of an ancient text?
That's the big question.
I mean, every single major religion on earth has radical fundamentalists who take archaic, frankly barbaric tribal rules far too literally. You can find extremist Christians or ultra-Orthodox Jews who, quote, horrifying genocidal passages from the Old Testament.
Sure.
Isn't Ibrahim essentially finding the most radical cleric on the internet and unfairly claiming he represents the theological baseline of an entire global faith?
And that is the central, highly contentious debate surrounding his thesis. A sociologist would argue exactly your point, that people are incredibly diverse and rarely follow their texts to the letter.
Right.
However, Ibrahim's argument relies on the internal mechanics of Islamic jurisprudence itself. He argues that while there are absolutely millions of nominal, secularized, or culturally moderate Muslims who want nothing to do with this hostility, the doctrine of al-wala wal-bara itself is considered ironclad within Sharia.
By ironclad, you mean it isn't open to modern reinterpretation, like they can't just revise it.
Exactly. We have to look at how Islamic law actually functions. In Sunni Islam, for instance, a massive component of jurisprudence is driven by ijma, which translates to the scholarly consensus of elite clerics over centuries.
Okay.
Unlike the Catholic Church, which has a pope who can issue new encyclicals or shift theological focus, Sharia is built on a massive foundation of past consensus that is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to simply rewrite.
Wow, so it's locked in.
Ibrahim argues that according to the established ijma, the fundamentalists preaching enmity are not perverting the religion or taking verses out of context. They are acting out the exact, formally agreed upon letter of the law.
That's a huge claim.
It is. Ibrahim's stark warning is that the moderates in the West are only moderate because they are actively ignoring or disobeying their own legal texts, whereas the radicals are radical precisely because they're adhering to those texts strictly.
That is a deeply unsettling framework. If we accept his premise that this intense loyalty and enmity serves as the required internal mindset, the psychological operating system, as we said earlier, how does this political system actually express itself in the physical world?
Right, because pent-up ideological energy has to release somehow.
Exactly. Which brings us to Ibrahim's second core doctrine, Jihad.
Jihad is perhaps the most universally recognized Arabic term in the West, yet Ibrahim argues it is the most fundamentally misunderstood.
How so?
Well, historically, early European translators and historians simply defined it as holy war. It was understood as a divinely mandated kinetic military obligation to physically expand the territory of Islam.
And it was heavily incentivized, right?
Yeah, highly incentivized by the theological promise that dying in this specific type of warfare guaranteed the martyr the highest levels of paradise.
But if you listen to modern Western academics or read contemporary apologists, they almost universally translate jihad simply as struggle or striving,
Right.
usually framing it as an internal spiritual struggle to overcome one's own sins and be a better person, like a personal self-improvement journey.
And this is exactly where Ibrahim's analysis applies immense pressure. He acknowledges that the literal etymological root of the Arabic word does indeed mean to struggle or to strive.
Okay.
But he argues that translating it purely as a peaceful internal struggle is not only historically inaccurate, it actually makes the concept more dangerous and highly adaptable than just defining it as kinetic warfare.
Wait, walk me through the mechanics of that adaptability. How does calling it a struggle make it more dangerous?
Because if the divine unalterable command is broadly to struggle and strive on behalf of the supremacy of Islam, the method of that struggle can shift based on tactical reality.
Oh, I see.
Historically, when the Islamic State possessed overwhelming military strength, that struggle manifested as violent, kinetic military conquest. But what happens when the Islamic world is militarily weaker than its neighbors?
They can't just fight a pitched battle.
Right. Or what happens when Muslim populations migrate to a Western host nation where they lack the military or political supremacy to wage physical war? The doctrine dictates that they do not abandon the jihad. They simply shift the mechanism.
They adapt.
Exactly. They transition to non-violent forms of struggle to achieve the exact same end goal of civilizational supremacy.
And he outlines several specific categories of this nonviolent jihad that clerics have historically articulated. There is the jihad of the tongue, which involves aggressive propaganda, preaching, making the faith look appealing to outsiders, while simultaneously utilizing rhetoric to demoralize Westerners about their own cultural heritage. Right. Then there is the jihad of the pen, which involves writing, academic influence, and intellectual subversion. There's the jihad of money, where wealthy individuals or state actors fund Islamist causes, build mosques, and endow university chairs to control the narrative.
And perhaps the most controversial vector he discusses is what he terms the baby jihad, which is the strategy of demographic conquest.
The demographic angle is fascinating because it weaponizes biology. He cites contemporary clerics who explicitly preach to Muslims migrating to Europe, instructing them that their religious duty in these new lands is to have as many children as physically possible.
To outbreed the host nation.
The explicit goal is to eventually overwhelm the secular host nations demographically. He points to demographic data showing that Muhammad is currently the most popular name for newborn baby boys in several major historically Christian European capitals.
The underlying strategic logic is simple. If you lack the military capacity to conquer a territory with tanks and aircraft because the host nation's military is overwhelmingly superior,
Which it is.
then you bypass the military entirely. You conquer the territory through the maternity ward over a span of a few generations.
To fully comprehend how these nonviolent strategies are justified within the theology, we have to unpack another critical concept Ibrahim details, the doctrine of Taqiyya.
Yes, this is the formalized doctrine of precaution, concealment, or deception.
I really want to spend some time on Taqiyya because understanding this completely changes how you interpret geopolitical actions.
It does. The mechanics of Taqiyya are deeply rooted in the historical timeline of the life of Muhammad, which, Islamic clerics utilize as the ultimate flawless behavioral blueprint for all believers for all time. Muhammad's prophethood was cleanly divided into two distinct historical and geographical phases. First, there was the Meccan phase. During his initial years preaching in the city of Mecca, he was in a position of severe weakness.
He didn't have an army yet.
Exactly. He was a marginalized figure, heavily outnumbered by hostile, powerful pagan tribes. He had a very small, vulnerable group of followers.
And Ibrahim emphasizes that if you look at the specific Quranic verses revealed during this Meccan phase of weakness, they are notably peaceful.
Very peaceful.
They preach tolerance, They advocate for coexistence. They absolutely do not call for holy war for the very pragmatic reason that calling for an armed uprising when you have 50 guys against an entire entrenched city-state is, well, it's tactical suicide.
It is. The theology perfectly mirrored the tactical reality of weakness. But then a massive historical shift occurs. The Hijra.
The migration.
Yes, the migration of Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to the city of Medina. In Medina, the paradigm completely flips. Muhammad rapidly evolves from a marginalized street preacher into a powerful political statesman and a military general.
He gains thousands of followers, he structures an army, and he begins a campaign of kinetic conquest.
Right. And Ibrahim points out that the Quranic verses revealed during this Medinan phase of strength take on a completely different, highly militant, aggressively commanding tone. They explicitly mandate fighting the infidel and subjugating non-believers.
So according to Ibrahim, Islamic jurists didn't just look at this as ancient history. They extracted a highly sophisticated three-phase tactical playbook for any Muslim community living in any era, based on those Meccan and Medinan phases.
It's a scalable blueprint.
Phase 1 is the Meccan phase. You are a minority, completely outnumbered and weak, living under non-Islamic, secular, or Christian rule. In this phase, you are legally permitted, even encouraged, to practice Taqiyya. You pretend to assimilate. You preach peace. You heavily quote the peaceful Meccan verses to reassure the host population.
Right, you play nice.
That phase 2 activates when you gain enough demographic density or political leverage to transition. You start demanding cultural concessions, separate legal tribunals, and you begin actively pushing back against the host culture's norms.
And then phase 3 is the Medinan phase. You have acquired the necessary strength to drop the deception, actively assert dominance, and formally enforce Sharia.
To explain why this dynamic is unique, Ibrahim draws a sharp contrast between the sacred texts of the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Quran.
Yeah, because when challenged by secular hosts who point out the extreme violence present in the Old Testament, Ibrahim offers a really structural and linguistic rebuttal.
Right, because the interviewer pushes back and says, look, the Old Testament is incredibly bloody. God explicitly tells Joshua to commit genocide against entire cities, wiping out men, women, and livestock. There are brutal laws about stoning people to death. How is Islam any different?
And Ibrahim argues the difference lies in the linguistic structure of the texts. He asserts that the violent passages in the Old Testament are entirely descriptive and historically finite.
Finite.
Yes, the text describes a specific, bounded historical conflict against specific named tribal entities. The Amalekites, the Hittites, the Jebusites.
Groups that literally no longer exist in the modern world.
Exactly. It is written in a temporal historical language. Therefore, a modern Christian or Jew reading the book of Joshua understands it as an ancient historical account of what happened in the Bronze Age, not as an active standing command for what they are legally required to do today.
By contrast, Ibrahim argues the Quranic commands regarding violence are prescriptive and open-ended. The text doesn't just say fight the Meccans in the year 624.
No.
It utilizes generalized categorical terms like fight the infidel or slay the idolaters wherever you find them. And crucially, the Arabic uses present tense imperative verbs.
That's the key.
So, according to Ibrahim's thesis, a fundamentalist believer reading that text today processes it as a direct, unexpired command from the creator of the universe, directed at them in the present moment, to fight whoever the non-believers happen to be in their immediate vicinity until they are politically subjugated.
Yeah.
But I have to construct a framework here to test the limits of his theory, because the implications are deeply troubling.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think of a submarine operating in hostile waters. It runs completely silent, undetected, avoiding all conflict. It isn't running silent because it's a pacifist vessel. It is running silent because there is a destroyer right above it dropping depth charges.
Right.
The silence is a tactical requirement of its current weakness, not a permanent moral stance. If we apply Ibrahim's concept of Taqiyya to a modern multicultural society, it suggests that a Muslim neighbor who is acting peacefully, integrating seamlessly, and being friendly might just be in the Meccan phase.
They might just be a submarine running silent, waiting for the tactical advantage to shift.
Doesn't this framework construct a deeply paranoid, practically unlivable societal trap where even a genuinely moderate, fundamentally peaceful human being is permanently viewed with intense baseline suspicion.
And that is the profound moral, social, and political dilemma that Ibrahim's thesis inevitably generates. If you accept his core premise that the foundational texts legally mandate tactical deception when weak and aggressive subjugation when strong, then genuine, structural trust between communities becomes theoretically impossible.
It just completely breaks down trust.
The interviewer challenges him on exactly this point, noting that every demographic group contains violent extremists. We have white supremacists, we have eco-terrorists, we have Christian extremists like Timothy McVeigh. The interviewer asks, why single out the theological architecture of Islam?
And Ibrahim's rebuttal to that is that while sociopaths and violent criminals will statically exist in every human population across time, Islam is unique because it provides a divine, pious veneer that actively justifies, systematizes, and eternally rewards that specific violent behavior when directed at the outgroup. He argues that a violent Christian extremist has to aggressively contort, ignore, or actively disobey the core New Testament teachings of Jesus, such as turning the other cheek or loving your enemy in order to commit an act of terror.
But a violent Muslim extremist, he claims, requires no such contortion. They have direct, literal, uncontorted textual support for kinetic violence in the Quran and in the historically documented military campaigns of Muhammad. Which logically brings us to the ultimate question of his thesis. What happens if the submarine finally surfaces?
What happens when the power dynamics shift?
What happens if the nonviolent jihad of demographics and subversion actually succeeds? Or if the host society degrades enough to simply be taken over? What is the specific architectural blueprint for that newly subjugated society?
And this brings us to Ibrahim's third doctrine, the legal status of the dhimmi. And he utilizes the complex history of Spain as his ultimate case study.
Let's transition to the Iberian Peninsula. The year is 711 AD. Islamic military forces cross the Strait of Gibraltar from North Africa and rapidly conquer almost the entirety of modern-day Spain and Portugal.
So, based on Ibrahim's framework, what actually happens to the massive population of native Christians and Jews living there? Are they subjected to total genocide?
Not total genocide. Islamic jurisprudence had already established a highly specific, codified legal category for the people of the book, primarily Jews and Christians, who possessed earlier scripture.
Okay.
If these populations agreed to formally submit to Islamic political authority and cease all military resistance, they weren't necessarily slaughtered. Instead, they were transitioned into the legal status of dhimmis. Yes, this was a formalized, institutionalized second-class citizenship. They were legally permitted to keep their religious beliefs and practice them privately, but in exchange, they were forced to pay a special, intentionally burdensome financial tribute known as the jizya.
But Ibrahim is very careful to emphasize that the jizya wasn't merely a bureaucratic tax. It wasn't just about the state collecting revenue to build roads.
No, it wasn't.
There was a deeply engineered psychological mechanism at play. He refers to this psychological state as dhimmitude. He points directly to Quran 9.29, which explicitly commands believers to fight the people of the book until they pay the tribute with willing submission and feel themselves subdued, or, in some translations, humbled and brought low.
Ibrahim details how this command to induce humiliation was historically operationalized. He describes specific practices devised by Islamic jurists regarding the collection of the tax.
This part is wild.
When a Christian came to physically hand over the jizya, the Islamic tax gatherer was legally required to physically strike them, perhaps slapping them on the back of the neck or aggressively pulling their beard.
The physical violence wasn't meant to be lethal.
No, it was a carefully calibrated ritual of degradation designed to constantly remind the dhimmi of their biologically and theologically inferior status.
It functions as an organic, multi-generational caste system. It's designed to break the spirit over centuries.
Precisely. And the psychological trauma of this system, Ibrahim notes, is incredibly profound. Over multiple generations, the minority population slowly internalizes this manufactured inferiority. The human mind adapts to survive, and eventually, these subjugated populations become genuinely grateful just for the basic fact that they aren't being actively massacred.
Like Stockholm Syndrome on a societal level.
In the interview, the host asks Ibrahim a very personal question. Why didn't his own parents, who were Coptic Christians emigrating from Egypt, harbor a burning vocal anger toward Muslims if this history of subjugation is accurate?
And his answer was chilling in its psychological clarity. He explained that they didn't harbor burning anger because they were literally born into the psychological matrix of dhimmitude.
It was completely normalized.
When you are born into a society where you have been a marginalized second-class citizen for 1,000 years, you don't fight the system. You accept it as the unalterable physics of the world. You keep your head down, you pay your tax, and you pray you aren't noticed.
To illustrate the unique nature of this religious subjugation, Ibrahim contrasts the Islamic conquests with the Mongol conquests.
All balls.
The Mongols were, objectively, arguably the most physically brutal conquerors in the history of the human race in terms of sheer kinetic body count.
We're talking about armies that would systematically depopulate entire regions and build literal pyramids out of human skulls to terrorize the next city into surrendering.
Yet Ibrahim notes a crucial distinction. The Mongols were remarkably, almost bizarrely religiously tolerant.
Really?
Yes. Once they successfully conquered your city and established political dominance, they largely did not care what god you worshipped. They did not operate on an ideologically supremacist religious model. Islam, according to Ibrahim's thesis, is entirely different because it actively demands both physical, political submission and a deep psychological religious submission.
This analysis of Spain directly attacks a very popular modern narrative.
Mm-hmm.
In Western academia, we are frequently taught that Islamic Spain, referred to as Al-Andalus, was this magnificent golden age of multicultural tolerance.
Oh, yeah, the convivencia.
The narrative is that Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together in beautiful harmony, sharing poetry, translating Greek philosophy, and advancing science, while the rest of Christian Europe was wallowing in the mud of the Dark Ages.
Ibrahim aggressively deconstructs that narrative. He argues that the Golden Age myth might apply to a few very brief, highly isolated decades of high culture, and even then, almost exclusively for the aristocratic elite in a few specific cities.
So it wasn't the norm.
Not at all. But for the vast, overwhelming majority of the 800 years that Islamic forces controlled parts of the Iberian Peninsula, he asserts it was a period defined by constant, brutal, grinding warfare, slave raids, and harsh subjugation of the native population.
To break the myth of tolerance, he brings up a specific historical event, the Martyrs of Cordoba, which occurred around the year 850 AD. This is right in the chronological center of this supposed era of glorious, tolerant coexistence.
These were native Christians who had lived for generations under the grinding psychological weight of dimitude. Eventually, the psychological pressure caused a segment of them to simply snap.
They just couldn't take it anymore.
They began publicly stepping into the town squares, openly blaspheming Muhammad, and loudly declaring their Christian faith, fully knowing the legal consequences under Sharia.
And how did the authorities of this supposedly tolerant Golden Age react? Ibrahim details the historical record showing how dozens of these Christians were brutally executed. They were beheaded, crucified, boiled alive in vats of oil, or skinned.
This constant friction eventually fuels the Reconquista. A small remnant of Christians who had held out in the rugged northern mountains of Spain began a slow, incredibly grueling, multi-generational war of attrition to take the peninsula back.
It took 800 years.
From 711 AD to 1492 AD. Now, 1492 is a foundational date we all learn in the West, but almost entirely for a different historical event.
Columbus making landfall in the Americas.
Right. But domestically in Spain, 1492 is the climactic year they finally besieged and conquered Granada, the very last Islamic stronghold on the peninsula.
And this specific moment is where Ibrahim's narrative takes a turn that deeply unsettles the standard Western historical consensus, specifically regarding the Spanish Inquisition.
The Spanish Inquisition is almost universally utilized in modern Western discourse as the ultimate shorthand historical example of crazed, bigoted, irrational, Christian religious fanaticism and deadly intolerance.
Nobody expects a Spanish Inquisition, right?
Exactly.
But Ibrahim re-engineers that entire narrative using the concept of weaponized deception. He claims that immediately after Granada fell in 1492, the victorious Spanish crown initially offered generous terms to the roughly 500,000 Muslims remaining in the territory.
It did.
The Spanish essentially said, you can stay here, you can keep your property, you can keep practicing your religion, just live in peace under our political rule. But according to Ibrahim, those Muslim populations almost immediately began attempting to violently subvert the new state.
They initiated alliances with predatory Barbary pirates from North Africa. They engaged in secret correspondence with the massive, expanding Ottoman Turkish Empire, actively trying to invite a foreign invasion to bring the Islamic Empire back into Spain.
Facing what they perceive as a massive existential fifth column within their own borders, the Spanish crown panicked and issued a draconian ultimatum: formally convert to Catholicism or immediately leave the country and relocate to North Africa.
And here is where the doctrine of Taqiyya activates on a massive societal scale.
Yeah, this is where it all comes together.
Ibrahim details how Islamic jurists located safely in North Africa issued formal fatwas binding religious legal decrees, explicitly instructing the Muslims trapped in Spain to publicly and officially convert to Christianity.
They were told to take the Eucharist, to attend Catholic Mass every Sunday, to baptize their children, and to act like model Spanish citizens in the public square, but to remain fiercely, secretly Muslim in their hearts and behind the closed doors of their homes.
The contemporary Spanish historical sources note with deep confusion and astonishment that these new converts, known as the Moriscos, were actually attending Mass more frequently and appearing more pious than the native Spaniards.
They constructed a flawless facade of integration.
But secretly, generation after generation, they were operating underground networks, teaching their children to hate the Christian infidel and continuing to plot the subversion of the state.
So Ibrahim's radical argument is that the Spanish Inquisition was not an outbreak of random, irrational religious bigotry. He frames it as a desperate, highly systematic counterintelligence and national security apparatus designed specifically to root out a massive, multi-generational network of political subversives who are actively utilizing divinely sanctioned deception to destroy the nation from within.
He essentially views the Inquisition as a logical, albeit brutal, tactical response to weaponize Taqiyya.
It is a profound, almost total inversion of the accepted historical narrative.
We are looking at a complete reassignment of historical villains and victims, taking one of the most universally reviled institutions in European history and arguing, well, you have to look at the unique, religiously sanctioned espionage they were trying to combat, is a radically different paradigm than anything taught in a standard university curriculum.
And that precise disruption of the accepted academic narrative brings us directly to Ibrahim's broader, more sweeping warning for the modern era. He argues that the West's current vulnerability is not primarily a military or economic vulnerability, it is fundamentally a narrative vulnerability.
He believes the Western mind is infected with what he specifically terms fake history.
He draws a very sharp distinction between fake news and fake history. Fake news is ephemeral. It's a lie about a political event that happened yesterday. It creates a temporary burst of chaos. People argue about it on social media, and then it fades away.
Right, it burns out.
But fake history is systemic. It creates an entire overarching paradigm through which you view reality. If your foundational understanding of the historical timeline is fundamentally inverted, every single geopolitical decision, immigration policy, or military strategy you formulate today will be inherently distorted.
Ibrahim points directly to the mainstream academic narrative regarding the Crusades as the most glaring, damaging example of this fake history. He quotes John Esposito, a highly prominent, widely assigned professor at Georgetown University.
Okay, what does Esposito say?
Esposito wrote in a textbook that there were 5 centuries of peaceful, fruitful coexistence between Christians and Muslims until the aggressive, religiously fanatical, imperialist First Crusade in 1095 abruptly ruined that peace.
Ibrahim's reaction to that specific academic claim is essentially one of sheer, unadulterated disbelief. He points out the mathematical absurdity of it. Those exact 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence Esposito refers to were the exact same centuries when Islamic armies were violently conquering 3/4 of the Christian world.
How can you call this subjugation of the Levant, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain peaceful coexistence?
You can't. Ibrahim highlights a specific event in the 11th century, just decades before the First Crusade, where one single radical Islamic caliph ordered the systemic destruction of 30,000 Christian churches across the Middle East, including the complete demolition of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, one of the holiest sites in Christendom.
He also extensively details the actions of the Seljuk Turks as they invaded the historically Christian region of Armenia. He describes how they besieged and entirely annihilated a thriving place known as the City of 1,001 Churches.
And what happened there?
The historical chronicles describe the Turks pulling out the entrails of the inhabitants in the streets and committing horrific, deliberate atrocities directly on the church altars to maximize the psychological terror.
Therefore, Ibrahim forcefully argues that the First Crusade was absolutely not an unprovoked, greedy European imperialist land grab, as it is popularly taught today.
No, he frames the Crusades as a vastly belated, desperate, purely defensive military rebuttal to over 4 centuries of unprovoked Islamic imperialism, territorial theft, and systemic atrocities committed against indigenous Christians and European pilgrims in the Holy Land.
And if reframing the Crusades wasn't controversial enough, Ibrahim takes this historical revisionism even further by stepping directly onto what is undoubtedly the most dangerous third rail in modern historical discourse: the era of European colonialism.
The section of the source material dealing with colonialism is intensely provocative. Ibrahim argues that the mandatory, unquestioned historical narrative in the West today can be summarized as white European man historically bad, everyone else globally innocent victims.
Now, to be clear, Ibrahim does not deny the historical reality that European colonialism involved horrific atrocities, systemic racism, and brutal economic exploitation. He fully acknowledges that the transatlantic slave trade was an abomination.
Right. His argument is not a denial of Western sins. It is an argument regarding historical context and proportionality. He points out that for the vast majority of human history, every powerful civilization engaged in violent imperialism and slavery.
Every single one.
The Islamic world, for example, engaged in a massive, brutal, deeply systematized slave trade for over a millennium, capturing and enslaving millions of Black Africans, Europeans from the Mediterranean coasts, and Asians.
Yet Ibrahim notes, in the modern Western educational system, students are taught exclusively about Western slavery and Western colonialism. This creates a bizarre historical myopia where the West actually believes it invented these evils.
And here is where he mounts a partial defense of the effects of European colonialism. He argues that when the European powers finally industrialized and grew technologically and militarily strong enough to push back into the Islamic world in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, they didn't solely bring exploitation.
Okay, what else did they bring?
He argues they brought the fruits of the Enlightenment: modern science, advanced medical practices, infrastructure, literacy programs, and the printing press to regions that he claims had been intellectually stagnated and economically devastated by centuries of rigid jihad and the anti-innovative culture of dhimitude.
To support this deeply controversial view, he claims that if you bypass modern post-colonial theory and actually read the primary source diaries and writings of local individuals living in places like Egypt during the high point of British colonialism in the late 1800s, many of those local voices actually describe that era as a time of unprecedented stability, legal fairness, and technological progress compared to the corrupt, violent rule of the Ottoman pashas that preceded it.
But I know you're going to push back on this.
I have to throw a massive roadblock up here because as analysts, we cannot let the claim that colonialism was the best time ever slide by without severe scrutiny. The physical brutality, the ruthless economic strip mining of entire continents, and the deliberate cultural erasure enacted by European colonialism are heavily documented, undeniable historical facts.
Absolutely.
You look at King Leopold in the Belgian Congo, where millions were mutilated or worked to death for rubber. You look at the engineered famines in British India. Is Ibrahim simply cherry-picking a few positive technological byproducts to fit a right-wing narrative that excuses or sanitizes Western imperialism simply because it happened to oppose Islamic imperialism? You don't get a moral pass on subjugating a native population just because you built a nice railroad to extract their resources faster.
That is a highly valid, structurally sound critique. A mainstream historian would immediately argue that Ibrahim is severely downplaying the sheer racial subjugation and economic extraction inherent in the colonial project by focusing disproportionately on the infrastructural byproducts.
Right.
However, looking at the architecture of his argument, Ibrahim's specific goal isn't necessarily to prove that colonialism was purely a benevolent charity project. His objective is to demonstrate that focusing solely on Western historical guilt creates a deeply dangerous geopolitical blind spot. If the Western mind is rigorously trained to believe that the West is uniquely historically evil and that the Islamic world is historically innocent and merely a passive victim of Western aggression, that fake history directly dictates disastrous modern policies.
It dictates foreign policy and immigration.
Exactly. It leads Western leaders to falsely assume that modern Islamic hostility, whether in the form of terrorism or demographic separatism, is merely a justified temporary reaction to past Western sins. Ibrahim argues it is not a reaction. It is the continuation of an unbroken 1400-year theological mandate for supremacy that has absolutely nothing to do with Western foreign policy.
Which brings us crashing right into the present moment and the acute existential crisis that Ibrahim believes the West is currently sleepwalking walking into. Why does he believe this specific clash of historical narratives is reaching a critical, highly dangerous tipping point right now?
He identifies a massive, highly destabilizing asymmetry in civilizational confidence. On one side of the ledger, you have the Islamic world. Despite being objectively weaker than the West in terms of modern military hardware and economic GDP, the Islamic world maintains absolute, unbroken ideological continuity and supreme, unshakable confidence in its own divine righteousness.
They aren't apologizing for their history.
Not at all. They do not look back at their history of violent conquest and feel the need to apologize or build memorials to the conquered. They view those conquests as the glorious, undeniable manifestation of the will of God. As Ibrahim succinctly puts it, many Muslims across the globe inherently feel like it's their time to rise again.
And then you look at the other side of the ledger. You have the modern West, which is currently suffering from a profound systemic loss of foundational confidence. We are experiencing widespread societal demoralization and a culture of chronic, almost performative self-flagellation.
Yeah, the cultural elite of the West seem entirely obsessed with meticulously deconstructing their own history, physically tearing down statues of their founders, and endlessly apologizing for the fact that their civilization even exists.
To illustrate exactly when and how this ideological divergence crystallized, Ibrahim points to a fascinating, highly influential historical figure, Sayyid Qutb.
Sayyid Qutb is a massively important figure to understand. He was a brilliant Egyptian intellectual, a poet, and eventually became the leading ideological theorist for the Muslim Brotherhood.
And he actually spent time in the U.S., right?
He did. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Egyptian government actually sent him on a scholarship to travel and study in the United States. He spent significant time studying in Greeley, Colorado.
Now, from a secular materialist perspective, you would assume that an intellectual coming from a developing nation like Egypt to 1950s America, which was the absolute, undisputed global peak of post-war economic power, safety, and booming middle-class prosperity, would be thoroughly awed and intimidated by the success of the American model.
You'd think he'd look at the pristine lawns, the interstate highways, the booming factories, and the consumer culture and think, wow, this is the pinnacle of human achievement.
But he absolutely did not.
His reaction was the exact opposite. He looked at American society, but he didn't judge it by its GDP. He judged it through the theological lens of al-wala wal-bara. He looked at the relative freedom and independence of women, the casual mixing of the sexes at church dances, the obsession with lawn care and consumer goods, the foundational separation of church and state, and he was utterly spiritually repulsed.
He hated it.
He viewed the American material success not as a triumph, but as the ultimate decadent manifestation of the infidel world that Muslims are commanded to disavow. He returned to Egypt and utilized that disgust to write the foundational texts for modern radical Islamism.
His ultimate conclusion was highly strategic, though. He said the West possesses great technological hardware, so we should absorb their scientific knowledge, but their cultural software is utterly degenerate, immoral, and spiritually pathetic. We must reject their values entirely and forcefully return to the pure, unyielding, fundamental Islam of the 7th century.
And Ibrahim argues that this dynamic Western material supremacy masking deep spiritual rot has only accelerated to the point of absurdity today. We are living in a bizarre paradox of power.
The modern West is militarily, technologically, and economically vastly superior to the Byzantine or Persian empires that were so easily crushed by the early Islamic armies. The West possesses nuclear arsenals, stealth bombers, and artificial intelligence.
Yet, Ibrahim argues, the West is voluntarily inviting its own demographic and cultural replacement through mass, unassimilated migration, simply because it lacks a unifying, confident cultural belief system required to defend its own borders.
He argues that historically, Christianity provided the necessary structural framework for Western humanism. It provided the deep foundational rationale for concepts like individual rights, the rule of law, and mutual tolerance.
But as the West has aggressively secularized over the last century, it has essentially hollowed out its own foundation. Ibrahim claims the West has turned the remnants of Christianity into what he derisively calls a doormat theology.
A doormat theology.
Yeah, a belief system where the only remaining virtues are infinite, uncritical tolerance and turning the other cheek to the point of literal civilizational suicide. By dismantling its own foundational mythos, the West has created a massive ideological vacuum.
And nature and geopolitics absolutely abhor a vacuum.
Yeah.
If a society fundamentally does not believe in its own right to exist, it will inevitably be conquered or absorbed by a society that believes in itself absolutely.
That is the crux of his warning. And he points to incredibly surreal modern realities to demonstrate just how deeply the West has been demoralized. He notes the sociological, bizarre reality in the United Kingdom, where a native British citizen can face severe legal trouble, or at least police harassment, for aggressively waving the St. George across the historic flag of England because authorities might deem it culturally offensive, aggressively nationalist, or inherently racist.
Yeah.
Yet those exact same police forces will routinely stand idly by while massive crowds of migrants wave the black flags of ISIS or openly chant for global jihad on the streets of central London. The host culture polices itself while granting immunity to the aggressive ideology of the newcomer.
He also brings Spain back into the conversation to highlight this amnesia. After fighting for 800 literal years, shedding absolute oceans of blood in the Reconquista to push out the Islamic conquerors and secure their sovereign borders, the modern Spanish government recently chose to open those exact same borders to 1 million undocumented migrants from Africa and the Middle East, offering them pathways to citizenship.
Ibrahim looks at that policy and diagnoses it as civilizational suicide. He essentially says, you have entirely forgotten who you are, you've forgotten the historical mechanics of how your enemy operates, and you have forgotten the agonizing price your ancestors paid to build your society.
I want to build a broader theoretical framework around this because I think there's a cyclical, secular dynamic at play here. When a biological entity like a cell or a macro entity like a human society experiences prolonged, unchallenged prosperity like the West has enjoyed since the end of World War II, it begins to change structurally.
Okay.
Think of a society like a muscle. When a muscle is constantly under the stress of gravity or resistance, it remains dense and strong. But if you remove the stress, if you put an astronaut at zero gravity for a year, the muscle atrophies and loses its rigid structure. My theory is that the West hasn't been chased by a lion in a really long time. We haven't faced a genuine existential threat to our daily survival that forces us to maintain a rigid cultural structure, to definitively say this set of values is essential for survival and that set of values is dangerous.
That's a fair point.
So, is this current crisis really about a specific, unique religious threat emanating from Islam? Or is it just the natural, unavoidable physics of human societies decaying over time? You know the famous cyclical adage, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Are we simply existing in the decadent weak men phase of the historical cycle, and Islam just happens to be the specific ideology that has the eye of the tiger right now, waiting to fill the void?
That is a highly sophisticated, secular, cyclical theory of historical progression. And interestingly, if you analyze Ibrahim's arguments closely, he does not entirely disagree with that cyclical assessment.
He doesn't.
No, he explicitly acknowledges that the West's current internal weakness and self-loathing is a massive, indispensable part of the equation. If the West were culturally strong, historically confident, and structurally sound, he suggests the Islamic expansionist drive would likely remain largely dormant and contained, precisely as it did during the height of the 19th century colonial era when Europe was projecting unquestioned power and operating as the undisputed, strong horse on the global stage.
Right. He even explicitly states in the interview, the Muslims aren't really the issue here. Well, they aren't invading with swords and spears like they did in the 7th century. The West is actively inviting them in. He places the ultimate blame squarely on the shoulders of the West for voluntarily abandoning its own heritage and disabling its own immune system.
However, where his thesis pushes beyond your cyclical theory is in his analysis of the specific replacement. He would likely argue that while civilizational decay is indeed a natural cyclical process, the specific nature of the ideology moving in to fill that resulting vacuum matters profoundly.
Software matters.
Exactly. If the West simply falls due to natural internal decay and is replaced by a standard secular empire, that is one historical trajectory. But if the West falls and the resulting vacuum is filled by a system running the specific theological software of al-wala wal-bara, the adaptable strategies of jihad, and the formalized subjugation of dimitude, the resulting society will not just be a new variation of empire.
It was something else entirely.
It'll be a highly specific, religiously mandated caste system that is designed to systematically, permanently dismantle the foundational humanistic values, free speech, equality before the law, freedom of conscience that the West spent centuries agonizingly building.
Wow. Well, we have covered an immense, incredibly dense amount of historical and theological ground today. Let's pull all these complex threads together.
We have meticulously traced Raymond Ibrahim's highly controversial paradigm-shifting view of Islam. He argues forcefully that the West must immediately cease viewing it merely as a private personal faith and must begin analyzing it as an unbroken, highly adaptable, 1400-year political and jurisprudential continuum.
We followed the narrative architecture of his argument, starting from the rapid 7th century military conquest that swallowed the ancient Christian heartlands, moving through the internal theological doctrines of absolute loyalty and enmity, analyzing the shifting, highly pragmatic tactics of violent and nonviolent jihad, and examining the profound, multi-generational psychological subjugation created by dimitude.
We looked deeply at the historical crucible of Spain, exploring the brutal realities of the 800-year Reconquista, and how Ibrahim radically reinterprets the Spanish Inquisition not as random bigotry, but as a desperate, systemic counterintelligence response to the weaponized doctrine of religious deception known as Taqiyya.
And finally, we examined his overarching diagnosis that the modern West is currently paralyzed by a self-inflicted fake history, a distorted academic narrative that paints Western civilization as uniquely, irredeemably evil and the Islamic world as a historically innocent victim.
This widespread demoralization, coupled with a total loss of foundational confidence, has left the West structurally hollow and entirely vulnerable to an ancient ideology that has never once lost its absolute confidence or its divine mandate to expand.
Now, as we prepare to wrap up, we must explicitly state our parameters one final time. You have been listening to a rigorous structural analysis of Raymond Ibrahim's viewpoints based on his specific interview.
We are acting entirely as neutral guides, walking you through this complex material.
We are absolutely not endorsing his views on Islam, we are not validating his specific interpretations of history, and we are not championing his critiques of Western society. Our sole objective was to break down the mechanics, the how and the why of his argument, so that you, our learner, can fully comprehend the architecture of this specific, highly influential geopolitical perspective.
True intellectual growth requires the courage to rigorously explore the arguments that most aggressively challenge our baseline assumptions, regardless of whether we ultimately decide to accept or reject those arguments after careful analysis.
Which brings us to our final lingering thought for today. Think back to that core tension we established at the very beginning, the collision between a 1400-year unbroken, supremely confident ideology and a modern technologically advanced society suffering from severe historical amnesia.
Right.
If we step back and survey the vast, sweeping arc of human history, it forces us to confront a profound, deeply uncomfortable question. Is the ultimate survival of a civilization truly determined by its material wealth, the size of its nuclear arsenal, and its mastery of technological hardware?
Or is a civilization's survival ultimately determined by the absolute, unwavering confidence it possesses in its own cultural software, its belief in its own story?
And what inevitably happens to a culture when it collectively decides that its own story is no longer worth defending?
That is the pivotal existential question residing at the very heart of the civilizational clash.
It is absolutely something to deeply mull over as you watch the evening news tonight and see these historical forces playing out in real time. Thank you for joining us on this intense intellectual journey today. Keep questioning the narratives you are handed, keep exploring the history behind the headlines, and keep diving deep.